Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Europe podcast, available every morning on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen. It's Thursday, the 5th of December here in London. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll in Paris, where French President Emmanuel Macron faces a deepening crisis after his government was toppled last night. As far-right leader Marine Le Pen sees her political star rise, the EU's second-largest economy could face months of political paralysis, and bond markets are taking note.
And in other news, UnitedHealth Group CEO Brian Thompson has been shot dead in New York, with the perpetrator still at large. Plus, topping $100,000, Bitcoin passes the milestone on news that Trump is picking a crypto proponent as his top financial regulator. Let's start with a roundup of our top stories.
French President Emmanuel Macron is this morning seeking a new prime minister after the government of Michel Barnier was toppled by a no-confidence vote. But whoever replaces Barnier will face the same difficulty in building support in the National Assembly and passing a budget that brings the country's budget deficit under control. Speaking ahead of the vote, Michel Barnier defended his plan, which contained €60 billion in tax hikes and spending cuts. His words are spoken by a translator.
60 billion in interest, which the French people will have to pay every year, which is higher than our defense budget or higher education budget, and it will certainly get even bigger if we do nothing.
Barnier was ousted after a left-wing coalition teamed up with far-right leader Marine Le Pen's National Rally Party to pass the no-confidence motion. She says the budget was not what the public voted for.
Stop public expenditures that the public is not in favor of. We are going to take this all the way, because the only response we've had just taxes, taxes, taxes.
As Marine Le Pen there speaking through a translator. The result of the vote, while expected, pitches the country into a period of turbulence that's likely to further unsettle investors.
Well, traders are now weighing the path ahead for the euro, with Skylar Montgomery-Koning of Barclays saying that events can only be considered a headwind for the currency. French borrowing costs relative to Germany's have soared in recent weeks, with the spread hitting the widest since the euro area debt crisis. And European Central Bank President Christine Lagarde is now calling on the European Union to ramp up efforts to unify its fragmented financial infrastructure. Writing in The Economist ahead of that French vote, Lagarde said Europe must refocus, exposing the key blockages in the financing pipeline and identifying a smaller number of solutions with the highest return.
Brian Thompson, the CEO of UnitedHealth Group, was shot dead in Manhattan on Wednesday morning. The 50-year-old was one of UnitedHealth's most senior executives and was outside the New York Hilton Midtown, where the company was hosting its Investor Day. The suspect fired multiple times before fleeing, prompting an ongoing manhunt. Here's New York Police Commissioner Jessica Tisch.
I want to be clear. At this time, every indication is that this was a premeditated, pre-planned, targeted attack.
Jessica Tisch there speaking as police offered a $10,000 reward for tips. According to the New York Police Department, Brian Thompson arrived in New York on Monday and didn't travel with a security detail. In a phone call with NBC News, his wife said he had been receiving threats.
Bitcoin has surged to a record of more than $100,000 after Donald Trump picked the crypto proponent Paul Atkins as the next head of the US securities regulator. The digital asset rose as much as 6.1% following the announcement that Atkins would replace Gary Gensler, who cracked down on digital assets. Nathan Dean, senior policy analyst at Bloomberg Intelligence, says the pick will bring significant change.
This is the first time that they've really had somebody in the regulatory repertoire, if you will, that's going to be thinking of the crypto world. And so, Commissioner Atkins, because he used to be a commissioner at the SEC, he has actually come out and has done a lot of work in the crypto space. But where we're going with this is that, the SEC chair has a really important role because they can put out a ruling giving a little bit more of the color of, okay, here what are the rules for crypto? Meaning if you have a security and you are an exchange like Coinbase, here's how you operate.
Nathan Dean from Bloomberg Intelligence speaking there. The crypto market has jumped by roughly $1.3 trillion since Donald Trump's election victory, with Bitcoin ETFs attracting a net inflow of about $32 billion.
The Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell says he expects to have good relations with the incoming Trump administration. Speaking at the New York Times Deal Book Summit, the central banker downplayed the prospects of tension with the president-elect.
There's a set of institutional relationships between the Fed and every administration. I fully expect that we'll have the same general kinds of relationships that we have, institutional relationships, for example, with the Council of Economic Advisors, but most importantly with the Treasury Department.
Jerome Powell speaking in New York. Turning to economic matters, he added that he expects Fed officials to move cautiously as they continue cutting rates, but that he says the economy is in remarkably good shape. His comments come as US stocks hit an all-time high owing to a rally in big tech, which drove the S&P 500 to its 56th closing record in 2024.
The CEO of Lloyds Bank has warned that the uncertainty around motor finance mis-selling is affecting investor confidence in British banking. Charlie Nunn says that investors have raised worries about the UK's lengthy review of car finance after a court ruling that could significantly broaden its scope. As part of the probe, the Financial Conduct Authority is considering giving lenders more time to respond to customer complaints about fixed commissions on auto loans. Lloyds, the biggest provider of car finance, has already set aside £450 million to pay for possible compensation and other costs linked to the investigation, which Moody's estimates could cost the industry overall some £30 billion. So those are our top stories for you this morning. Let's have a look at the markets then right now. We do have fresh political storms. Earlier this week it was South Korea, now it is France. Asian equities this morning are lower, down by 0.1% for the MSCI Asia Pacific Index. The S&P 500, though, yesterday hit another all-time record high. Jerome Powell talking about the US economy being in remarkably good shape. We also did see Bitcoin pass through $100,000 this morning. We trade at $102,200, up by 4.4% for Bitcoin. South Korea's won has slipped. The euro is steady, trading at 1.0527. The Japanese yen going further to the downside. The Bank of Japan possibly preparing to hike interest rates. An OPEC Plus meeting today, oil prices trading at $72.26, so down 0.1%. And stock futures for the European market open this morning, currently down by 0.1%. So those are the markets. Now, in a moment, we'll talk more broadly about the markets than that. Bitcoin, $100,000. But, of course, Emmanuel Macron faces a deepening political crisis after the no-confidence vote last night, backed by Marine Le Pen's national rally, which toppled the government, led by the Prime Minister Michel Barnier. Stephen Carroll is live in Paris for us this morning. Stephen, you were there last night watching what was happening in Parliament. Macron is due to make an address to the nation. What should we expect after this blow to his authority?
I mean, look, it's a question of what sort of tone Emmanuel Macron is going to choose to take and whether or not he will have any announcement to make in that special address to the nation that he's making later. He arrived back in France from a visit to Saudi Arabia just as the vote was happening, toppling the government of Michel Barnier, making Barnier the shortest lived prime minister in modern French political history, just 91 days in office. So Emmanuel Macron will be expected to give some details about what happens next, but there are no hints as to what the president plans to talk about in this address. What people want answers to is who's going to run the government, who's going to lead a government, how quickly they're going to be appointed, and how they're going to tackle some of the big issues facing France, not least the financial ones.
Indeed. I mean, Michel Barnier himself was sort of the answer to a difficult problem, wasn't he? What went wrong, do you think, for Michel Barnier?
I mean, he was dealt a very poor hand to start out. He had no majority in Parliament to begin with. The choice of Michel Barnier was meant to try and inspire centrist politicians to come together with this person who'd stepped, into the political fray, someone who had a 50-year career in politics in France and had held already several senior ministries, as well as his jobs in the European Union, that those outside of France might know him for better. But he was supposed to be the person that was going to bring on board more people to Macron's centrist alliance. He did his best. He said that he was going to negotiate in Parliament to try and get agreement on a budget. There were some compromises reached on some issues, but not enough for him to survive a vote on, this was the social security budget that he used the constitutional override to force through Parliament, triggering the no confidence vote. I mean, listening to him last night in Parliament, he was talking about how things will get worse now if the government falls, as it did subsequently. And look, it just wasn't a very easy job to begin with, but that begs the question of who could do it better and who could resolve those seemingly intractable problems that whoever is going to be taking this job next is going to face.
What does it mean now for Marine Le Pen, who was also central to toppling the government?
Well, look, I mean, she is coming from a position of strength now, her having allied with a left-wing alliance in Parliament, which by itself is quite controversial because they have extremely differing views on things, and supporters of Emmanuel Macron and Michel Barnier were quick to point out the I suppose controversial nature of this alliance, that the left wing and the far right chose to vote together on this issue despite all of their differences and the many criticisms that would have come from those left wing parties of some of the policies of Marine Le Pen's party too. But I mean, she has an eye, and she pointed to it in her speech in Parliament yesterday, supporting this motion of no confidence on what Emmanuel Macron does next. She said she wouldn't call on him to resign. That was a decision for him. Some of the left-wing politicians were out there straight away saying that Emmanuel Macron needs to resign. But Macron has until 2027 on his term. There is no mechanism to remove him from office. Marine Le Pen knows that she's leading in the polls if there were to be a presidential election held now. This is a moment that she can exact pressure, because actually getting her group on board, or at least convincing them to abstain from a vote on a future budget, could be key to whatever agreement or alliance is created next. Perhaps she can get some of her key policies actually into a budget that she can claim credit for.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what does happen now with no budget agreed? Because that was the sticking point. And of course, there can't be any elections either until next year.
I mean, in the short term, what happens is at 10 o'clock this morning, we will see Michel Barnier present the resignation of his government. The next steps to try and keep the government running is that a special law can be passed through Parliament. This is thought to be the simplest way to enact this, which essentially puts the government on a month-to-month budget where they get a 12th of what was the current year's budget allocated to each department. That will keep benefits being paid, taxes being collected, and government services running as well. But it is something that is going to make life much more difficult, and it's certainly not going to tackle problems around the budget deficit or do anything to calm market fears over France's fiscal path.
Yes, indeed. Well, when we think about that market situation then, obviously the kind of turmoil in the run-up to the vote yesterday has roiled financial markets, although overnight the euros actually remained fairly calm. And I mentioned also that Bitcoin topped $100,000. So I want to bring in at this point, Stephen, Bloomberg's multi-asset reporter Mary Nicola to join us for a conversation. Mary, good morning. What do you think is the impact then of France's political shock on markets, given the outcome of the vote? I mean, it was expected, that vote last night.
Yeah, it was. And I think there's arguably a lot priced in, but at the same time, there's still so much uncertainty, as both you and Stephen had mentioned, that suggests that the worst isn't behind us. So you still have a new government that will have to be formed and a credible budget that needs to be passed. And given the political disarray, there's probably a lot more to come. Growth in France is already very tepid. Monetary policy remains relatively restrictive, and especially when you look at the growth outlook. And then not to mention that the budget metrics looks worse than many of its peers within Europe, suggesting that it's going to continually be penalized by markets for that.
Yeah, OK, so that's one significant issue that we'll be watching in markets today then. Any further signs of market stress, especially when the bond markets in Europe open. In terms of Bitcoin, the other big story in markets, dramatic rally after Trump has picked a crypto advocate to lead the SEC. That's quite a change, isn't it, for that main regulator in the US and globally?
It is. And I think one of the things that probably excites a lot of crypto bulls is the fact that you're seeing this intersection between, the TradFi and the DeFi investing. And that could potentially mean that you smooth the way for more people to buy this asset class. So in general, we could expect that the administration, of course, is going to be a lot friendlier to crypto than some of the other previous administrations, which does give some confidence to more people to dive into that asset class.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.